Warning: disturbing content, viewer discretion is advised. Serious: what is the most shocking thing someone confessed while on their deathbed? I have a good and a bad story for this thread. I'll start with the good. It's not precisely on the deathbed, but as close as she was able to at the time. My aunt had cancer. She knew she was going to die, and she knew it would probably be in less than a week. She couldn't eat, and drinking was hard. She wanted to be sedated heavily, kept asleep permanently, essentially, for the last few days because this whole dying thing sucks, and I've had more than enough. So fair enough, a doctor is called up, a plan is made and carried out. The last thing my aunt said before going under for the rest of her life was, "Ah, I see the stars, they're sweet and run carefree. Gather them up." And that's when she went under. She died 3 days later. Nobody knows what she meant. But somehow, those last words fit her, so my uncle, her husband, got them tattooed on his chest, over his heart. The bad. My other uncle had been in a car accident. It was bad. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital, he said, "Tell my wife that Wendy is my daughter, and I love her," name changed for privacy. He died a few minutes later because of internal bleeding. Wendy was the neighbor's then 5-year-old child. That caused a huge shitstorm, I can tell you. My father told me that in addition to 2 other kids he had that I knew of, there were more children of his out there. Also that only 2 of his kids were with the same woman. 4 of them showed up at his service, in addition to the other 2, making it 7 of us present. We also found out that he may have had other kids elsewhere, but my family kept really poor records of things, so I have never found out who they are. Most of that was word of mouth from old friends of his. Weird note, but all of us got together and now stay in contact. We had a good amount in common and saw each other when we could. I had an old uncle who refused to die until his long-life mistress came to see him. When he was in a new country and met an amazing woman, but when he went home to visit, an arranged marriage was set for him, and his father was ill, so he ended up staying and having kids. He later immigrated back with his new family and found his old love had never moved on. He never stopped loving her, either. They got back together. Both women knew of each other but never met. His kids called her Andy and knew of her but never met her. On his deathbed he kept on fighting to live. His son asked him, "Do you want to see Andy?" His eyes grew as he tried to communicate yes. The son called Andy to let her know he was dying. She said she knew and was waiting in her car out in the parking lot. Andy came to see him, and within 5 minutes, he passed away in her arms. My mom was from China, though we are now happily residing in a European country. We went back to China for my grandmother's last few weeks as she was dying from terminal cancer. On my grandma's last days, she requested that mom stays with her alone, and it was only then she revealed that my mom wasn't her biological kid. My grandma confessed that she had bought my mom from a child trafficking ring, which was common in China, because she had tried for many years and still couldn't get pregnant. My mother cried a lot, not only for the unimaginable pain that her biological parents likely went through in losing a baby, but also for the fact that my grandparents have gone beyond to treat my mom as their little princess. They literally did treat my mom as their own. They were never abusive and only gave her the very best in life. They even willingly send my mom to the US for university education, even though they aren't rich by any means. Shortly after he was diagnosed as suffering from the final stages of heart failure, a few weeks before he died, my grandfather told me several stories about World War II that changed my view of him and war in general. Now, before I start, I should tell you that my grandfather was one of the kindest men you'd ever meet. Always friendly, never drank, the kind of guy who gave the shirt off his back to those who needed it and handed out the biggest candy bars in town on Halloween. Everyone loved him. Shortly after D-Day, my grandfather was part of a 12-man rifle squad fighting in northern France. As his unit entered a seemingly abandoned village, they were ambushed by a squad of Germans, and the unit was torn apart. They won. But by the end of the fight, only 3 of the Americans were still alive, and one of them was badly wounded. The squad leader and his assistant were dead. The 2 unwounded soldiers swept the battle scene and hauled 3 badly wounded German Wehrmacht soldiers into the middle of the street. My grandfather looked at the other American soldier, said no prisoners, and cut the throat of one of the Germans right there. He said he almost puked because there was way more blood than he was expecting. His partner lifted his rifle to shoot the other 2, but my grandfather stopped them. He said that there might have been other German soldiers nearby and didn't want the gunfire attracting them. So they dragged the other 2 into the shallow ditch on the side of the road, with about 6 inches of water in it, and stood on the German soldiers' heads until they drowned. After that, he said he hated Germans. He confessed to a number of war crimes, including shooting German civilians and killing German soldiers who were trying to surrender, apparently a not uncommon occurrence. But the worst? He told me that he only felt guilty about one thing he'd done. In early 1945 his new squad was going through a small German village when he and a couple of other guys kicked in the door to a small house. Inside was a small old German woman in a wheelchair, who immediately started screaming and cursing at them in perfect English. My grandfather kicked her wheelchair over, rolled it out the door, and then knocked an oil lamp over as he left the house with his partners. She burned to death. He looked at me with cold eyes and said, "That was too cruel. She was an old woman. I should have just shot her." Damn. My dad had an impacted bowel and was heavily medicated. Before he went in for exploratory surgery, he tried to write a letter to me expressing his feelings. He could barely talk before he went into surgery. He kissed me and had tears in his eyes, knowing it was the end. The paper was folded and said on the front, "Only open if I die." While he was in surgery, I selfishly opened it. It was a few paragraphs of unreadable scribbles that I couldn't read. He made it through the surgery but also got stiff since the hospital sucked at washing him, so he was put into hospice, which is basically where you're put to death. I know this isn't quite that bad, but if he died, I'd never know what that note said, and it would weigh on me for my entire life. He later told me, "It probably said how much I loved you and wished I did more for you or some shit. You know, dad stuff." He's the best. My grandpa when he was dying. He awoke after being asleep for most of the day, and it was around 2 a.m., and my cousin and me were on watch to wake up my mother, who's a nurse, if anything was going wrong. He sat straight up and looked right through me as if I wasn't there and started talking to his sister, who had passed decades before. He loved her so much and always talked about how much he missed her. He was having a conversation, "Hey Lena, I've missed you, it hurts," followed by unintelligible mumbling and groaning. It wasn't so much what he said but how he said it, as if she was standing in my place or right behind me. He didn't even acknowledge me, and it really kind of freaked me out. The next one, which is actually a cherished memory, was when my grandmother from the other side of my family was in hospice and on her way out. She and I always used to joke about death, and how it was shocking. She was the last of my grandparents as she smoked, drank, and stayed up all hours of the night watching TV. She was my best friend for my whole life, and really I wish I would have known it was the last time we would talk. She was in her hospital bed and looked at me as I held her hand, and she says, "I'm ready now. You want the jello now, Grandma?" I asked her. She genuinely guffawed and said, "No, I'm ready. I'm ready to go chase rainbows," and she relaxed and said she was tired and wanted a nap. My son, who was 2 at the time, said "I love you" as we left, and she was the second person he ever said that to. Fuck. I'm crying just thinking about it. She was such an awesome woman. Miss you, Grandma. My grandfather and I were never close despite us all living together. We're both arrogant know-it-alls, so our personalities clashed. I loved each other, just rarely had anything to say to each other. Anyways, most of the family is away on a trip with just me and my siblings looking after him and Grandma when his heart condition worsens. We take him to the hospital, and I get told, "This is it." And then tell him the same. He just nods silently and goes, "Yeah, I figured." I spend every day by his side while studying for my exams, and again we don't talk much. Family books quickest flight back and arrive just a few days before he passes. Found out a week after his death that when I was off writing an exam, he told my mom he was insanely proud of me for keeping everything together and that I wasn't as lazy or self-absorbed as he once thought. I never got that hug and final understanding moment with him, but I'll always love and remember him fondly. I'm glad we did understand each other, even if it wasn't face to face. My mother-in-law worked at a nursing home, so she had seen death. But one stuck with her. A patient knew he or she was near death and called out for anyone to listen. She listened. The patient said that when they were young, their father had been out drinking with some friends, and on the way home, he had hit a little girl. Gave very specific details about where and when it happened. The girl was maybe 3 years old. Her father and his friends buried the little girl under the porch steps and never spoke of it again. The person had lived with the guilt of keeping it a secret and felt horrible that the little girl's family would never know what had happened. They had to let someone else know. I'm using a throwaway for this one. My grandpa's whole career was in the military. He joined just after World War II since he had just turned 18 as World War II ended. He and his 6 brothers all joined at the same time. Their first time seeing combat was in Korea. My grandpa was a paratrooper, and one of his brothers was a field medic. The six didn't get put into any of the same squads for some reason. He said that during a really intense firefight, his squad crossed paths with his brother's squad. His brother was trying to help an injured squad member when he was shot 3 times. Twice in the back and once in the chest. My grandpa ran to drag him out of the way and pulled him behind cover. He held his brother in his arm behind cover and comforted him as he died. They both knew his brother wasn't making it out of this serious injury. His brother died a few minutes after being shot, and this made something in my grandpa's head just snap. He said for the rest of the war, he used the Koreans as his way of dealing with the anger of his brother dying. He went from being a terrified, inexperienced combat troop to a killing machine. He said during the rest of the war, he felt no fear, only hatred. He would fight with incredible zeal and ferocity. He didn't specify how many people he actually killed. All he said was, "The day my brother died was the day I became a killer." He didn't say how many he actually killed because if I told you, you would see me as a much different man. I wasn't a man at that point. I was a cold-hearted murderer out to watch them suffer. He claimed that when the opportunity came, he would actively try to inflict as much agony on enemy troops as possible. When they were injured, and on the ground, he would beat them, kick them, cut off their fingers, knock their teeth out, stomp on their legs to break them, etc. He only did this when there were no other allies around. He literally started acting like a serial killer, torturing his victims, and didn't want any of his fellow troops to see him do this. It was dishonorable and inhumane, but he didn't care. He was just filled with rage. My grandpa received a Purple Heart and multiple prestigious military honors once the war was over. He said that if anyone found out about the horrors and inhumane actions he committed during the war, the awards would probably have been taken away. He said his time in Korea was the only time he felt like something other than human. He said it made him feel like a truly evil force, and he liked it. This shocked us since he was the kindest, most gentleman I had ever known. He never swore, never got angry, and was incredibly tame and loving. His marriage was fantastic, and he made sure to show my dad and my aunt nothing but love when they were growing up. You would never take him as the type of guy to excitedly kill people in battle. My grandpa died with a lot of secrets that we will now never know. He only confessed to his horribly dirty fighting tactics in war because he wanted to die with some of his conscience clear. He never even told my grandma about what he did during the war until this point. I believe he had some underlying problems that led to him acting like he did in the war. He said it was a bloodlust that he had never felt before, and the sight of enemy Koreans suffering in pain got him excited and bursting with happiness. My grandpa wasn't a bad man. I believe the stress of the war and his brother dying in his arms was enough for him to go against everything he previously stood for. He went into the war with the intent to serve his country but ended up fighting for his own bloodlust and rage. I can't ask him to tell me more since he's been long dead, but I believe he did much worse than just torture injured enemies. Thankfully this ended up not being his last words, but man did it make me appreciate this man more. A best friend of mine has this grandpa. Real sweet old grump that's slowly going down in his years. Well, last year, he got really sick and was hospitalized and was even going a bit delusional. A friend calls me and asks if I can be there to see him since he basically sees me as another grandkid. So I make the drive and ask my friend to keep me posted on his health. Again, we thought this was the end, so we all wanted to say our last words to him. My phone goes off, I answer worried only to hear my best friend laughing hysterically. "Papa wants to know if you're okay." Yeah? He keeps freaking out that we need to find you cause you shot yourself in the foot. At this point, I was laughing hard too. I'm basically in the Army Reserves, and this sweet old grump worries about the silly adopted grandkid even when we are sure he's knocking on death's door. He's okay now. When my grandma, Mom's side, died, she had spent at least 3 weeks in a semi-conscious, or more like a quasi-dream state, before finally dying. During those weeks, she would constantly tell my mother that a boat was waiting for her house was on a lake, and her deathbed was in a room that overlooked it, and if it was all right if she could get on it. This persisted, along with my grandmother having full conversations with relatives who were dead years before I was even born, until one day when my grandma asked my mother if it would be all right if she could leave on the boat again, to which my mother finally replied with "It's all right if you want to." My grandma died a couple of hours later. Eerie little tidbit. My grandmother's watch, which was in another room at the time of her death, stopped at the exact time of my grandmother's death. Apparently it's pretty common for weird stuff to happen around the time of death for people in my family. When an uncle, who I never met, died, a car of his that hadn't worked for years suddenly turned on, And when my grandma, dad's side, died, the doorbell at my parents' gate rang, but no one was standing there. You can see the gate from the kitchen, so it would have been impossible for someone to doorbell ditch in time.